Welcome. Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another program in the Conversations with Great Leaders series. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, you are now in Hunter College's Public Policy Institute called Roosevelt House, which is also the historic home of Sarah and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. As we were all talking about, there's the four freedoms right behind you. Roosevelt House is the Institute's home in New York, thanks to a wonderful partnership with Jennifer Rabb, president of Hunter College, and her wonderful staff. I would also like to make a special welcome to the Institute's Society of Fellows and Vanguard members. These are people who are actually actively involved in the Institute, and we do special programming for them every year in addition to the public programs we're doing right now. Coming in September, we're going to be doing a private program for the Society of Fellows and Vanguard with two former congressmen talking about the upcoming election. Yes, which election indeed? My colleague Irene Lukoff, is she here? Irene has more information about the program we're going to be doing, which often takes place in people's homes around New York City. So if you'd like to know more about it, please talk to Irene after the program. So Conversation with Great Leaders in memory of Preston Robert Tisch began in 2009 as a way to feature people who are doing amazing things, making a difference in their communities by the way they look at their role in helping to build a civil society. And at the Aspen Institute, a civil society is a kind of society that we all want to be a part of. These leaders represent the values and commitments to the public good and reflect the belief and works of the man honored by this series, Bob Tisch. His family, Steve, Lori, and Lizzie and John Tisch, as well as the Lori M. Tisch Illumination Fund, generously make it possible for the Institute to bring you incredible leaders like the man you're going to be listening to tonight. So, tonight's program is going to be dealing with a topic that is of great concern to the functioning of a civil society: the growing number of people who are displaced by wars, famines, and other disasters around the world. David Miliband is someone who knows firsthand the challenges of finding new homes for the rapidly growing number of refugees in the world. As president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, he oversees the agency's humanitarian relief operations in more than 30 war-affected countries and its refugee resettlement and assistance programs in 25 U.S. cities. David was the 74th Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010, Secretary of State for the Environment, and a Member of Parliament for South Shields from 2001 to 2013. Joining him tonight in conversation is our moderator, Michael Doyle, who is a professor at Columbia University and the director of Columbia's Global Policy Initiative. From 2006 to 2013, he was an individual member and a chair of the UN Democracy Fund. Michael previously served as an Assistant Secretary General and a Special Advisor to United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. So now I'd like to turn the program over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Linda, for those wonderful introductions. Looking at the wall in back of me, I can't help but remark on the last phrase, God in his own way, everywhere in the world, wants to guarantee the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. That's a powerful statement from long ago. I'm just delighted to accept the invitation of the Aspen Institute to pose questions to David Miliband on the crisis in the Syrian refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis. I can think of no one better to be front and center in attempting to help us understand the full dimensions of this crisis and what should be done about it. What I'd like to do is pose three questions, starting from the global, working to policy, and then something more specific to him before I open to your questions coming from the audience. The first is a big picture question about the nature and origins of this crisis. It's directed as much to the former Foreign Secretary as to the President of the IRC. Let me give you a quote to introduce the question. Peter Sutherland, the United Nations Special Representative for International Migration, recently remarked, and here I quote, "Today we are living the worst crisis of forced displacement since the Second World War. Almost 60 million people have been compelled to flee their homes due to conflict or other dangers. 20 million of them are cross-border refugees. 4 years ago, 10,000 people on average were forced from their homes every single day. Now that number exceeds 40,000 people." I want to probe why is this so? And one further introductory point, and to push it a little further, reflecting, I think, some widely shared astonishment in Europe. Bono, in recent testimony before the US Senate, could someone turn off their phone? Bono remarked and lamented, and I quote again, "In 1989, the wall came down. In 2016, barbed wire is going up." Again, talking about his fellow Europeans. But the world that we live in is not caught up in another global war, not even a Cold War of the sort that inspired the 1951 Convention on Refugees. There are no major international wars at present. Grim as the number 20 million of refugees is, it represents only 0.3% of the global population. This should be solvable, but yet, arguably, we're not solving it. So the first question I'd like to pose to David is, how should we understand this global refugee crisis, of which the Syrian refugee crisis is so headline an element? What is driving it? Why hasn't the international community been able to solve it?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm reminded of sitting in an oral exam for entry into Oxford University. I'll try and do better than I did then. I should first of all say it's a tremendous honor to be here tonight in this house. I mean, what an extraordinary inspiration. Franklin Roosevelt, in one of his first speeches as American president, went to address the Daughters of the American Revolution in Washington, and he opened his speech by saying, "Good morning, fellow immigrants," which is maybe relevant to our discussion tonight. And I do want to acknowledge the Tisch family and what an extraordinary legacy of achievement across New York, and to be able to host these kind of conversations. I went back and saw some of the people that you've had here before, so I'm honored to be in their shoes. First of all, let's get the dimensions of the quote-unquote crisis clear before we call it a crisis, or to ensure that we understand the nature of it. 1 in every 120 people on the planet is fleeing conflict at the moment. 20 million of them are refugees, 40 million of them are internally displaced people. That means homeless people within their own countries, people rendered homeless within their own countries. Syria is the poster child for that, 5 million refugees, 7 million internally displaced people, but there are 2.5 million internally displaced people in the northeast of Nigeria. There are 2 million Afghans in Pakistan. There are people fleeing, for goodness sake, from South Sudan today to Darfur. Of all the places in the world that you'd think no one would ever want to flee to, they're fleeing to Darfur. Frankly, there are people fleeing from Yemen to Somalia. So you can get a sense of the drive, the push factors, the fear that is driving people to flee their own homes. And I think that the quantity of people deserves the term crisis, but so does, if you like, the qualities of the exodus that is taking place around the world today. What are those qualities? I mean, one indicator is that this is not short-term flight. The average refugee is out of their own country for 17 years. 80% of refugees are out of their own country for more than a decade. The average civil war, and I'll come back to that, lasts for 37 years. So we are in the midst of global tumult that has a character of long duration. Secondly, we're in the midst of a crisis, not just because of numbers, not just because of duration, but also the features of refugee flight today reflect some of the features of globalization that are talked about in this institute and elsewhere. For example, 60% of refugees today are not in the refugee camps that are the iconic image of a refugee. 60% of refugees are in urban areas. So the phenomenon of urbanization is one that is a feature of refugee life. So if you go to Beirut, if you go to Istanbul, if you go to Nairobi, if you go to Peshawar, what you see is local people, but also lots of refugees. The third feature that I think is noteworthy is that all the continents of the world, in South Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, frankly, almost everywhere except North America, are affected by refugee flows. And if you think about the Central American exodus of 2 summers ago, you can see that America is not immune from the North America is not immune from this either. And I think it is important to underline, we'll probably talk a lot tonight about the Syria crisis, but most of the world's refugees and most of the world's IDPs are in Africa, not in the Middle East. And nothing is more calculated to annoy Africans, or frankly people who live in the Middle East, than the description of a European refugee crisis. Because of course the idea that this should only become a crisis when it features in European newspapers is designed to enrage. This is a crisis of Middle Eastern and African and South Asian proportions and origins. So, why? You said, why is it happening? And so I would put 3 points on the table for you to think about. The first is that we are, and this does speak to the foreign policy end of the telescope as much as it does to the humanitarian worker end of the telescope. The first reason I would adduce to explain this crisis of this exodus is that we're living through an age when there are probably 25 to 30 states around the world which are vulnerable either to a failure to reconcile difference within peaceful boundaries, or a failure to meet basic needs, or both. And obviously the Syria case is a classic example of a failure to reconcile difference within peaceful boundaries. The South Sudan case is also an example of a failure to reconcile differences peacefully, but it's also an example of a failure to meet basic needs. And I think that the phenomenon of weak states is one that is important. On its own, it wouldn't explain the current exodus. Reason 2 is that the international system, and this is probably something that you're in certainly a more scholarly position to observe than I am, the international system is weaker and more divided, certainly than any time since the end of the Cold War, and you can make a pretty good case that it's weaker than during the Cold War. Because the Cold War was a period of organized division, whereas we're now living through an era of disorganized fragmentation. And the anchor of the Cold War has obviously been lost. It's a good thing, but the ability to hold conflict and dispersal within limits has become very, very potent and very clear. And the third reason is extremely difficult to talk about, but I think is important, and I wouldn't be being honest if I didn't mention it. The third reason we are witnessing a global exodus of the kind that we are seeing is encapsulated in the following fact, which is that the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, was founded in New York in 1933 by Albert Einstein to rescue Jews from Europe. And today, 40 to 45% of our work is in Muslim-majority countries, tending to the implosion or explosion that is taking place in a number of Muslim states, a large number of Muslim states, seeking to reconcile, in very crude terms, Islam with modernity. And it's important to say that not every Muslim-majority state is struggling in this way. You can think of Indonesia, you can think of Bangladesh, you can think of other countries, you can think of Turkey. But a significant number of Muslim-majority countries are undergoing fundamental tumult of a really basic kind around issues of identity, issues of governance, issues of accountability. And that is an important part of the equation in understanding why we should be living through this time. And I hesitate enormously to venture into this terrain because it's full of eggshells, and it's easy to be ignorant, and it's easy to be misunderstood. But I think if you want to understand why are 20 million people refugees, why are 40 million people IDPs, you've got to look at weak states, you've got to look at a weak international system, but you've also got to look at big issues of identity and modernity within an important number of Muslim-majority countries.
Well, you certainly outlined, I think I need to use this, you certainly outlined an extraordinarily large challenge to be faced. As part of it, you highlighted for us that, number one, this is not predominantly to be seen as a European crisis. That is, as you mentioned, most of even the Syrian refugees are being cared for, housed in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And the other part that I'd like to probe you a little further on is the emergency relief model that many of us take out of the press, out of the headlines, that what's needed is food, shelter, medicine. But as you also mentioned in describing the global shape of this crisis, it's much more a crisis of protracted displacement, where most of the refugees find themselves in settings, whether as in a camp or in cities, that's a long-term displacement. It's not just showing up and then able to go back home or be resettled. In a camp that I think you visited, Dadaab, which is...
I'm actually going next week, so...
Okay, well, here's what I've been told about it. I've not been there. But the camp has been there. It houses Somali refugees.
It's in Kenya. It's in eastern Kenya.
It's in Kenya, housing Somalis. It's the largest single refugee camp in the world with 345,000 people, it's said. They've been there now for more than 17 years. And 1/3 of the inhabitants of the camp, if my number is correct, were born there. So we're not talking about an emergency relief effort. We're talking about something that's very different. There's a phrase in the community of what's called, and let me get it right, it's permanent short-term solutions shaping what's happening here. So my question is, permanent short-term solutions sound like what they are, a contradiction in terms. What can and should be done for these protracted displacements where 17 years is what is to be expected, not the unusual, and providing shelter, food, and medicine, important as that is something very short of what human beings need if they'll be living in a place for 17 years.
Yeah, look, it's a great point. And I would, just to make it more difficult, this is not just a moral issue that people are being, that it's not right to ask people simply to survive or help people simply survive for generations. Frankly, it's also an instrumental issue of public policy in the sense that go to Kenya and anyone will tell you you're storing up trouble in having 350,000 people housed in a refugee camp in a hopeless and despairing way. I mean, it's not an accident that Boko Haram want to try and infiltrate that. Equally, though, you're storing up trouble if you have 200,000 Syrian boys and girls in Lebanon who are not getting an education, which is happening today. 200,000 Syrian boys and girls are in Lebanese schools, but 200,000 Syrian boys and girls are not getting an education in Lebanon. And I think that there is both therefore a moral and a instrumental reason to think that a humanitarian sector founded on short-term grants to provide emergency relief to help people survive is not adequate to the modern era. And that's certainly the reason why I am a champion not just of more aid, but of better aid. And better aid has got to be different aid. And there are 3 or 4 fundamental parts to it. One, the most vulnerable cases need expert support and help, and that will often have to come in third countries, in richer countries. So the fact that the US, the UK are actually admitting very few numbers of Syrians, but also others, compared to the scale of the problem, is certainly neglectful at best and irresponsible at worst. Secondly, the fact that 1% of the global refugee population went home in 2014, home being defined as the country of from which they came from, not the refugee camp they came from, tells you that it's not enough just to say, we're housing you here temporarily, whether in an urban area or in a camp, because you're going to be able to go home. I mean, no one's going home to Somalia anytime soon, and I'm afraid people aren't going to be going back to Syria anytime soon. They're not going to go back to Burundi anytime soon, because the conflict there is, the embers are still glowing. So that leaves you with a single possible solution, which is integration into the local economy. And that is going to take a completely different kind of deal, which goes way beyond quote-unquote humanitarian funding and is about financing the economic development needs of countries like Kenya, countries like Jordan, and financing them over a 10 to 15 to 20-year period. And here's the fix. The World Bank, which is the institution designed to help support poor countries and promote development, under its current mandate, is not allowed to work in Jordan or Lebanon because they're classified as middle-income countries. Now, the good news is that the president of the World Bank is actually onto this, and he's in the process of trying to change it. But when you think about an international political structure out of sync with the needs of the modern world, the fact that Lebanon is expected to re-gear, reboot its economy for 1.2 million refugees out of a population of 4.5 million without the support of the World Bank tells you the extent of the problem that exists. So the second, point one, refugee resettlement is an important part of the solution, but it will never be a majority part. Point two, integration into the local economy is absolutely key. Thirdly, the humanitarian aid system has to become much less divorced from the quote-unquote development system. This is something that you've written about and that you know a lot about. At the moment, we have one set of stovepipes that are called humanitarian aid and another set of stovepipes that are called development. One is meant to be about temporary relief, the other is meant to be about helping poor people become richer. And the truth is, there's an increasing overlap between the number of people who are affected by crisis, displaced by crisis, and the number of people who are poor. 43% of the world's extreme poor are now living in conflict or fragile states. And that's why people like me and you, if I may say so, argue that the humanitarian and development systems have got to work much more closely together.
Let me press you a little bit. The World Bank has obviously a vital role to play, and so do regional development banks. Bilateral donors as well have a role to play. What about the private sector? You know, when they work well, they create long-term jobs that are sustainable, that can make refugees into the real assets they are. These are often educated populations desperate to work hard. Does the private sector have a role in places like the camps in northern Jordan or in downtown Beirut, which is jam-packed full of Syrian refugees?
Well, the private sector exists in the camps. Mm-hmm. The Dutch government announced that they were going to ship, I think, 3,000 bicycles to Zaatari refugee camp, and within 2 weeks, bicycle repair shops were sprouting up all over. But I think that's probably not the private sector you're talking about. I mean, frankly, I'm a camp skeptic when it comes to long-term solutions. I mean, camps are not a long-term solution. They might be a short-term transit need. But when I talk about the World Bank, that is not about public sector jobs. I mean, the World Bank is there to set a framework to support private sector job creation. And I think the way to think about it is that the task is to align short-term response to refugee flows with medium-term, if you like, national, economic and social and, frankly, political modernization needs in countries like Kenya or in countries like Jordan or Lebanon. And that's a difficult thing, but I think there's obviously, you need a functioning private sector that's able to employ people, not just employ refugees, but also employ local people. One of the big things that we warn against is if you give only help to refugees and don't give help to local populations, you end up with tension and trouble. So I'm skeptical of quote-unquote jobs only for refugees or special tariffs only for refugee companies or something like that. You've got to be careful that you don't set up a perverse set of incentives. But I think you do want to be saying that the fiction, which is convenient for the West and often convenient for local governments, that this is a short-term problem, that fiction has to be ended. Right. And it's a fiction which bedevils the aid system, but it also bedevils the economic response too.
Thank you for that. Let me move to the issue of specific policy. Recently, the European Union and Turkey have struck a deal for the return of refugee claimants, predominantly from Greece, to go back to Turkey. And the exchange, as I understand it, is 1-for-1. The Europeans will directly take someone in a refugee setting in Turkey for each claimant that goes back to Turkey from Greece. And then there's $6 billion attached to this arrangement as well, and very important to the Turks, visa-free access into the EU.
Into the Schengen area, not into
The Schengen area. The question I'd pose to you is, what do you make of this deal? It's been controversial amongst some of your colleagues in the humanitarian community, Amnesty International, a few others, and it's been defended by other colleagues, strong spokesmen for humanitarian protections. I was wondering, what kind of attention should we have
the amnesty concern is not about the deal per se, it's about whether or not Turkey is living up to its obligations under international humanitarian law in respect of not shipping refugees back into Syria. Look, my view is that the real issue is that the deal isn't working. And if you think about it, the reason is that there is a very odd incentive built into it. Because the only people who are going to be legally allowed out of Europe, out of Turkey into Europe, are those who come in return for someone who goes illegally out of Turkey into Europe and is then shipped back to Turkey. So it's a very odd incentive structure if you stop and think about it for a moment. So as someone who thinks this does need to be a European solution, does need engagement with Turkey, although brackets, it needs engagement with Lebanon and Jordan as well, and northern Iraq actually, but primarily Lebanon and Jordan in addition to Turkey, who does think there needs to be a legal route for people to find a way out of the Middle East. I'm concerned that it's going to blow up. That's my concern about this. And the fact that there's very little relocation going on of people between different European countries. The EU said 160,000 people should be relocated across the European Union. That doesn't seem to be happening. So I'm concerned that this deal is going to need a bit more work. The fact that the Turkish Prime Minister resigned overnight is not a good sign on this, because he's been very engaged in negotiating this. I think there is a broader geopolitical point about this, though. What we're really paying the price for is that for 6 years, Turkey has been turning away from Europe, and Europe has been turning away from Turkey. And that has been a really dangerous turn with mistakes on both sides, frankly, and we're paying the price of it now.
A last question. You're a former politician. And
recovering politician.
Who has many times in the past persuaded voters and constituents. We now have a strange set of attitudes here in the U.S. I know that you're a recent immigrant.
No, I'm a resident, not an immigrant. So okay, I have no votes, and I'm not seeking new citizenship.
All right, a resident.
Still loyal to Her Majesty the Queen.
Learning the U.S. political scene. And let me quote to you a few figures from the Pew Research Center. It turns out that 40% of self-identified Democrats in the U.S. think that refugees are a threat to the U.S. These are self-identified members of the Democratic Party. 74% of self-identified members of the Republican Party regard refugees as a threat to the United States. And 85% of those who identify themselves as supporters of Donald Trump regard refugees as threats to the United States. My question to you as a former professional politician who recognizes, as many of American politicians do, but not enough, the need to provide succor and protection for refugees seeking refuge here in the country. How does one speak to these people in a way that is convincing and that helps us meet our obligations?
Well, the only way to convince people is for refugees to speak for themselves. I mean, there's no good me saying it takes 18 to 24 months for someone to come to the US as a refugee, that they're vetted by the CIA and the FBI and 12 other agencies, et cetera, et cetera. The only way, you've got to fight emotion with facts and emotion. And the facts, if they come from refugees, have got a chance of breaking through. So I think one's got to have a sense of perspective about that. But I think you've also got to ask, what are the origins of the statistics? And I think there are two, one of which is obvious and one of which may be less obvious. The obvious point is that the terror attacks in Paris and then in San Bernardino, even though they weren't committed by refugees, the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And the lie about the passport on the Syrian on the Syrian suicide bomber in Paris was halfway around the world before the truth got its boots on. The truth was that it was a fake passport. So part of the explanation for the numbers is that there's a war on facts, and that's difficult. The second reason, though, I think is important, and it behooves us to be careful about it, and that is that issues of refugee status and issues of immigration have become confused. And it's very hard in the public discourse to force a distinction, because people talk about migrants. I mean, even the BBC talks about migrants. I have a running feud with the BBC about the fact that the migrant crisis is not the same as the refugee crisis. They now have a footnote at the bottom of their website which says, we use the term migrant to include refugees and economic immigrants. My argument with them is that migrant has taken on a pejorative meaning, and actually it's now occluding the facts rather than contributing. But I think my own experience in the UK in the late 90s is that the immigration issue and the refugee issue became confused. It was called asylum at the time. The immigration and asylum systems became confused, and it's very, very hard to fight your way out of that corner. And I think that if you want a clue to how you fight back, one has to think both about explaining the security measures that exist, but also about making the distinction between economic immigrants and refugees. And it's going to be very hard in a situation where America doesn't have a grip on its immigration system, or on the way the immigration system works, and until it reforms its immigration system. I think refugees may be one of the victims of that.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. On that same point, I noticed a news story, which I just want to mention briefly today. Syrian refugees in Canada are taking up a collection to support people who are fleeing the area where there's this massive urban fire in Fort McMurray.
Wow.
And they're taking up a national collection to support Canadians fleeing the fire. I think that's the kind of message that would be helpful for all of our purposes. Thank you very much for answering those questions.
Did I pass?
So
Did I get in?
Candidly, yeah. And so I'm very
My
pleased now to
entry
open it up to the audience. Please feel free to ask any question you would like and identify yourself when you would do so. And there are mics that are around. I'll take the privilege of letting my good friend Rita Hauser have the first question.
Do I need a mic or? Thank you, okay. Rita Hauser, I chair the board here at Roosevelt House. One of the things, David, that perplexes me very much is that nobody talks anymore about stateless persons. And many of these refugees, long time where they are, lose their prior nationality. They do not acquire a nationality of the place they're in unless they become integrated as, and they have no legal protection whatsoever of the most fundamental nature. They belong to no state. And we saw what happened in the period leading up to World War II, when the first thing that the Nazis did was to deprive Jews and others of their nationality. What is the view that you have about that, sir?
I think it's a great point, and it's a point that's getting lost in the scale of the flows, because obviously the stateless populations are small by comparison. I mean, if you think about the situation of the Rohingya minority in Burma, Myanmar, that is a classic example of people who are being denied their status. The establishment of the status of someone as a refugee, in a way, gives them a claim. And so the registration drive of UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees and others, becomes really important. But I think the truth is that it's hard to wage a campaign for stateless people. It is possible to wage a campaign on behalf of victimized people, and that's the approach that we're taking in respect of the Rohingya Muslim minority population in Burma, Myanmar.
Could I have a follow-up? I know there are many hands out there, and I'll go to them in just a moment. For Rita's question, so if you're stateless and you've been denied, let's say, by Burma, and you're being supported temporarily by Malaysia, and you have children, what is your long-run prospects? Is it local integration? Is the only way to go?
Depends on the immigration rules
of
the country where your kids are born. Mm-hmm. And that's so if your kids are born in the US, obviously the kids become a US citizen, and that's the truth.
Okay, thank you. The lady in the blue coat.
Hi, my name is Carol Spelmer, and I'm just interested in knowing, from your perspective, if there weren't the constraints, how would you like to see this refugee crisis and migrant crisis solved and dealt with?
I mean, there are two answers to that question. One, as long as there are civil wars blowing up in the way that they are, then we're always going to be overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. As long as the Somalias of this world, the Afghanistans of this world are not resolved, then the Syrias, then we're going to always be on an uphill struggle. And without wishing to be glib about it, one of my learnings is that for all the talk of military interventions, diplomatic interventions, development and humanitarian interventions, the lesson of every civil war is that until you establish a legitimate and credible basis for the sharing of power between different communities in a given state or sub-region, you will not be able to end the fighting. And it's the credible and legitimate sharing of power that, let me give you an example, keeps Lebanon from blowing up at the moment. Lebanon hasn't had a census since 1935, that helps, but the fact that the civil war was ended in the end by every community having a stake in power is the thing that keeps that country from falling apart. And that's hard to deliver, but it's the absence of that credible and legitimate sharing of power that explains the situation in Iraq today, explains the situation in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
Yes.
You're not convinced?
I was actually more interested, given the state of the unrest, what would you do with all the refugees right now?
So I think, yeah, look, at the moment, I think that the 0.013 figure that you use is the percentage of global income that's put in towards the humanitarian help. It's a $25 billion sector of the global economy. But it's not just a financing problem. The only answer, essentially, is that the UN figure is that 10% of refugees need to be relocated in third countries. So that speaks to the refugee resettlement issue. But then you have a massive bargain to be had with the refugee hosting countries. And that is a bargain between the international financial community, international financial institutions, and local economies. Because at the moment, if you're the government in Kenya, you face the same political crisis that is here. Well, we don't want refugees to come here because they'll, quote unquote, take our jobs. And you've got to have a plan to expand the pie to make it locally, politically acceptable for people to enter the local labour market. Until that happens, there's going to be no progress. Now, interestingly enough, the London conference in February of this year proposed such a plan for Lebanon and Jordan. And the number of Gulf countries were very significantly supportive of it. And the deal was not just a humanitarian bargain, it was a $40 billion investment bargain for Lebanon and for Jordan, which are countries that, for whom $40 billion is a lot of money. And that is the kind of shift in thinking that's the only way to make this, to offer any hope of dignity for people.
Yeah, that's I think it's a very powerful solution. But as you've also hinted, the prior element has to do with the formation of some kind of a coalition, cross ethnicities and cross groups that allow for a new legitimate basis for government. And if we look at Lebanon, if it's going to absorb that many more Syrians, it upsets that delicate, hidden ethnic balance you talked about. And for our friends in Jordan, they absorbed Palestinians once before, which nearly destroyed their state. And so accepting Syrians, there's a big political activity, I think, that needs to accompany that very powerful initiative that you just put on the table.
That is true, but I would say this in the most humble and careful way. Jordan is your second closest ally in the Middle East, but the help you've given them is not consistent with that strategic importance.
Right. Yes, if we talked about the UNHCR figure, 10% is about 400,000 Syrians that UNHCR thinks need to be resettled from Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. It's a major challenge still. Yes, the gentleman right in the back, right there in the middle. Yes, with the red tie.
Hi, my name is Oren McCluskey. It is ironic and poignant that it appears that the only country that seriously addressed the refugee problem, at least through its leader, is Germany. What can you say about what in the German initiative can be replicated, and is there any other political leader in the world on the level of the German Chancellor?
Well, that's a great question, and the history weighs heavily on every street in Germany, and any of us who've spent time not only in Berlin but all over the country know that. One thing which I think people don't recognize is the scale of refugee flow into Germany after the Second World War. The number of Germans who came back. I did an event with a German politician 2 months ago, and he made the point to me that it's not just the obvious historical point of Germany's role in the 30s and 40s that makes this, I think you said, ironic or striking. But he made the point that the net inflow of refugees with the redrawing of European boundaries after the Second World War created a whole flow of refugees, including his family, into Germany. And so it's not just the Holocaust and the Second World War that's a big part of the German psyche, so is the flow of people. And you think about Danzig and Gdansk and you know the story. Now, I think that Mrs. Merkel's decision last summer was in part a recognition of reality. Remember, there were 400,000 or 500,000 Syrians already in Germany at that point. So she was, the Dublin Convention, so-called, which was meant to ensure that refugees were registered in the country, the European country that they landed in, was not being observed. And people were going to Germany anyway. So she was partly recognizing reality. I think the big thing that needs to be different in other countries is that you need a plan before you announce you need a plan to announce, not just an aspiration to announce. And I think that the resilience of German society, and frankly the resilience of her political position, she's not on my side of the political spectrum, but you've got to admire the leadership that she's offered. And she's still got 48% popularity rating, so many of us would give quite a lot for that sort of rating. And so I think rumors of her demise are much exaggerated. But to be fair, the German system is working through the shock of 1 million people arriving. They need the respite, though, of the deal that we were talking about earlier. Because if another 1 million people arrive in this summer, that's going to stretch the country in a really tough way. You asked about other politicians. I mean, it's not fair to go through everyone, but Justin Trudeau comes in. He says 25,000 refugees are coming to Canada. 25,000 this year, 25,000 next year. And it's part of the identity of the country. So I think it's not impossible, but it's hard because the immigration asylum debate is a really tough debate across the Western world at the moment.
Thank you. Yes, the lady over there.
Good evening. My name is Selena Cuff, and I'd love to get your thoughts on the role that advocacy groups like the One Campaign play in helping to identify and or secure better aid and the local integration of refugees into their host countries.
It's a great question. I mean, the One Campaign is a anti-poverty campaign launched around the Make Poverty History campaign. It's done a lot, and it's got a big debate going on at the moment. And the debate is precisely this. Do we continue to focus on poverty, or do we take up the issue of people in crisis? Now, my case to them is, with 43% of the world's extreme poor living in crisis and fragile states, this is your issue. But it would be wrong to ignore the point that lots of people feel that there's unfinished business in the crusade campaign to lift people out of poverty in stable settings, and they're fearful that this refugee issue is going to dilute or divert attention from the fact that there are still hundreds of millions of people in poverty in places like India and elsewhere. My point to them is that the greatest steps in tackling poverty have been made in countries that aren't just stable, and they're countries that have got economic growth, they're countries with large levels of remittances, and overseas aid has actually been a limited part of the anti-poverty strategy in the countries that have made the greatest strides against poverty. And so I think there's a real room for the tactics of organizations like the One Campaign to be applied in this area, and it's about humanizing the story and turning it from a statistical artifact into a real human need. And just, sorry to, I've just written an article for because I'm doing a big fundraiser in London on Monday, and I opened the article by saying there are two reactions to the scale of the refugee crisis. One reaction is, oh my goodness, this is just insoluble. And the other reaction is, well, I want to do something. And I feel very strongly that one of the things we have to fight is the sense of disempowerment that is felt by people who do want to do something. The Pope went to Lampedusa off Italy, and he said, he sort of laid down an accusation in 2013. He said the world is suffering from the globalization of indifference. So, which is an incredible phrase. I mean, a really beautiful phrase. But I'm not sure it's right. I'm not sure it's right that people are indifferent. I think they feel their compassion, but they don't know what to do. And that's where I think the obligation is on NGOs to explain not just what's wrong, but what can be done to make a difference. And so we spend a lot of time talking about our programs to tackle violence against women and protection of kids. We talk a lot about our programs on education. We talk a lot about our health programming. And even in the midst of disaster, in a way, this is sort of the question you were asking, even in the midst of the most unspeakable trauma, you can make a difference. And the resilience of people and their ability to bounce back is something that I think we've got to convey to people. Sorry.
Yes, please.
Laurie.
I have a little bit of a softball question.
Softball questions are gratefully received.
Exactly. Or in my parlance, a football question. Can you just very briefly talk about what the IRC does and doesn't do? And also, do you coordinate with any governments, whether it be our government? Does it have to be a friendly government, either to the United States or to another country? And how and it's a long question, how you decide kind of where you do and don't go?
Great. Look, I'd love to answer that question, and I'll tell you what we do, and I'll offer you the chance to do something as well. So this is about what you can do, not just what we do. But in brief, that was in brief, we have 3 entry criteria for any crisis situation. 1, is there a crisis or the threat of crisis? 2, is there poverty and vulnerability? And 3, is there lack of local or other international capacity? And only when those 3 boxes are ticked do we go in. So if someone else is able to do the healthcare provision, well, we don't go there. But in the southwest of Syria, where there are 360,000 people dependent for their primary healthcare on us, we're needed. And we can't believe we've got 1,600 people working for us inside Syria at the moment. So we have very clear entry criteria. What do? We're not just a single focus organization. We're about, sorry to be cliched about it, but we're about thriving, not just surviving. So yes, we are about water and sanitation and healthcare, which helps people survive. We're also about education and economic livelihoods that gives them the chance to thrive. And so we run savings and loans institutions. We run education and training facilities in fragile states, but also sometimes in conflict areas. And we do a lot of work to protect women and kids. So we're a multi-mandate organization. I'm sad to say 86% of our funding comes from governments, which we, of course, are grateful for, but which we know comes with a lot of strings attached to it. And the biggest string is the following. I told you that the average duration of a refugee's time outside their own country is 17 years. The average duration of the government grants that we administer is 11 months. So we are on talk about short-term, what did you call it, temporary short-term solutions. We're on short-term temporary rations, and we've got long-term problems. When you think about planning the education provision for kids, if you're on 11-month grants, that's a problem. So what can you do? Something less obvious and then something more obvious. The fact that we are a refugee resettlement agency in New York and New Jersey, as well as in 25 other cities across the US, means that locally, if you live in New York or New Jersey, you can mentor and support refugees who are arriving in this city every day. They're mainly not from Syria, but they're here. And you may have students who want to do that. You may have kids or grandkids who want to do that. You may even want to do it yourself. And these are people who arrive speaking no English, not knowing their way around. We run the only summer program for kids to be prepared for entering New York high schools in September. There's nothing for them. If you arrive and you're going into high school in September, there's nothing for you. At least 120 kids get help through our Refugee Youth Summer Academy. Secondly, you may be an employer who is able to employ refugees. You may be able to offer us your expertise. If you're a lawyer, you can offer pro bono support, because charities spend a lot of money on legal and other fees. We could use support for that. And the third thing, obviously, is I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say we wanted private donors as well. Because we need donors who are ready to be the signature investors in our organization to break the syndrome of short-term response. And I hope you don't mind my saying this, but donors support the UN to exist and to deliver programs. They support NGOs to deliver programs. But surprise, surprise, you can't deliver good programs if you don't run the back office properly. And that is where private donors have got a unique role to play in making sure that we're able to build up the infrastructure to run our organization properly, to make sure that we've got the finance, the procurement, the HR systems, as well as the front of house programs that can really make a difference.
Yes. Yes, in the UN, when we used to say that we brought 20,000 refugees back from Site 2 in Thailand to Cambodia, it meant that a contract was let to a courageous NGO who moved the 20,000 refugees back to Cambodia. So the UN is fully aware of the partnership it has to have with institutions like yours and many, many others. I think Alice had a question.
Alice Henkin. This is a small issue, but one that's bothering me. The Turkey-Germany deal, one of the effects of it has been to heighten the tension between the Syrian refugees and the non-Syrian refugees, because it's only the Syrians, I gather, who are able to benefit from this Turkish deal. I wonder what your take is on this arrangement.
Well, I mean, that's not quite right, if I may say so, because although if you're a refugee, for the sake of argument, from Afghanistan with a well-founded fear of persecution, then you have a right to refugee status in Europe, independent of the deal.
But where can you make that claim?
In Germany, or in any other European country. So the deal applies to Syrian refugees. It doesn't mean that the only refugees that Europe is going to accept are Syrian refugees. The only ones who are going to be accepted through this arrangement fall into that category. Where I think you may have picked up is that it is, and this is a hard thing to say, but if we're going to maintain the distinction between a refugee and an economic immigrant, not that one is good and the other is bad, but they're different with different rights, that if in fact you're an immigrant, for the sake of argument, from Morocco, who's applying for asylum in Europe, you're not going to get it because you're an economic immigrant, not a refugee. And that's where there's an issue about people being sent, quote unquote, sent back. And there are people applying for refugee status from the Balkans in Europe, but the Balkans have got candidate status for entering the EU. And that's where I'm afraid policing the divide between refugees and immigrants remains important. Different countries can have different immigration policies, but there are international responsibilities for all states that are signatories to the Geneva Convention in respect of how they treat refugees.
Yes, in the back over there. Thank you.
Thank you for, as always, good presentation.
Thank you.
But my concern is that you, like most other heads of these organizations, focus on the same countries, i.e. United States and Europe, in terms of the things that we can do. But here we've got China, who has second largest economy in the world. They don't show up in any of these issues in terms of donations, nothing close to their ability. And yet we've got, these poor countries in Europe, economies are not as good as they once were, and we're expecting more from them. So when is the international community going to do something about this?
Well, look, the first rule of politics is never to argue with the questioner, but on this case I have to argue with you because, China is a country still with 300 million people living in poverty. Per capita income is lower than any European country. Well, to be fair, I don't want to. I'm not here. I'm not their lawyer, but I think that the development needs of China, as development needs, are greatest within China. The greatest number of people who've been helped out of poverty in the last 10 years are Chinese. What's I think interesting is that the Chinese are making, I think, Lana or someone may want to correct me, but what looks like a strategic decision to invest in UN peacekeeping. The number of the Chinese contribution to UN peacekeeping missions, which is something we haven't really talked about, the sort of upstream issues. They are, I think I'm right in saying, they're the largest of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. They're now the largest, not donors, but contributors of troops to UN peacekeeping missions. And it's one example of China moving to becoming a contributor to the international system rather than a claimant on the international system. I mean, the UK has only, we doubled at President Obama's peacekeeping summit last September, the number of UK peacekeepers from 250 to 500. And I don't even want to talk about the American non-contribution to UN peacekeeping. But so I think in respect to the Chinese, it's a bit unfair. I do think it's important to recognize, though, that there are now rich countries, notably in the Gulf, that are becoming donors to the UN and other systems. And the big question is, are they going to be contributors to the multilateral system, or are they going to create a separate multilateral system of their own? And it's striking. Look, Kuwait has been important in this. It's a big contributor. We get support from countries like the UAE. That's an important step forward. For the first time, Saudi Arabia gave $500 million to the UN system in respect of Iraqi refugees. Previously, Saudi money had always gone in separate from the UN system. And I think that's where the battle is to be joined.
If I could say, I think I agree with some of the premises of the questioner, fully accepting your point that the very most important thing that China has done in the past 30 years is to provide a path to prosperity for its own poor, and then to hold itself together as a stable country. Two immensely important achievements. But that said, there's a good deal of discretionary money that goes through the state apparatus that's available for foreign investment and others. They have a perfect right to make those investments. But those are large figures that could, I think, be made available for global public goods like supporting refugees, fortunately also moving forward on peacekeeping. And I wouldn't rule out completely the possibility of even resettlement. It's a very large country. It'd be not impossible to imagine Rohingya showing up and becoming good citizens of Shanghai someday. But I accept the premises that, number one, their own poor and holding themselves together are the two biggest things that have contributed to the international order in the past generation or two. Any other questions? Yes, I think this will have to be, there are two, and those will be the last two questions.
Why don't you take the two of them together? And
yes, why don't we bring the two together? Yes, please, this lady.
Hi, my name is Melissa Leffis. Thanks for your talk. I wanted to just circle back to what was discussed about the fear that people have around refugees. And we talked a little bit about Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, but there is a lot of attention on the foreign terrorist fighter. And I was curious to hear your views on how that dovetails with IRC's work and the refugee crisis that we're witnessing today.
Our work in the US?
No. Globally. How are we, there's bars on accessing refugee status if you've participated in conflict. So I'm just wondering how are we screening? What is your view on this? Are we exaggerating the issue? Does it need to be paid closer attention to? Just generally how you see sort of counterterrorism agendas dovetailing with the refugee crisis.
And there's one other questioner over there.
My question is, why was it so hard for the politicians to establish a non-bombing, like a peace zone within Syria, so this all be avoided? Because clearly it's no good for either Syrians or Europeans or whoever.
Good. Just to take the first question first, I think that it's important that those of us who are advocating for the rights of refugees have got to also support effective security screening. That's an easier thing to do in the US than it is in Europe for obvious reasons of geography. But we've also got to support it in countries like Kenya. And it's hard. It's very, very difficult, but it's necessary. Now, the US is actually blessed and by geography and is insulated from many of the problems. Frankly, if you want to commit terrorism in the US, you don't try and come here as a refugee because it takes far too long and is far too difficult.
You come as a student.
Well, I didn't say that. I'm not saying that. But you might say that. I couldn't possibly comment. But it's valid to be concerned. And it's not that refugees are terrorists, it's that terrorists will use refugee flows as a cover for what they want to do. However, the evidence is, and we know this from a simple search of the facts, the greatest numbers of terrorists are those who've been homegrown from Europe, but also the San Bernardino issue speaks to the danger of homegrown terrorism. Now, where I think there's a real, there are two real debates to be had. One is about the issue of people going from Western countries, but not only Western countries, to Syria, fighting, training, and then coming back. That's obviously a massively difficult security issue. But there's also a real debate to be had about the origins of the radicalization. There's a whole debate led by this French writer Olivier Roy, who writes about whether the religion is driving the radicalization or the radicalization is driving the religion. And I think that's an open debate that is well worth having. Just on it's a good place to end is your question about you interestingly refer to a no bombing zone, which is very rarely discussed. People often talk about no fly zone, and they don't talk about no bombing zone. The idea of a no bombing zone is that, well, what it says on the tin, it's an area where you're not going to tolerate the random bombing of civilian areas. And the answer to your question is quite simple. I mean, it hasn't happened for two reasons. One, the Security Council is utterly divided because the Russians believe that the ability to bomb has been critical to the re-establishment of the authority or the sway of the Assad regime. And the West and others, because Turkey was the first to argue for a no bombing zone, have not wanted to take unilateral action outside the UN framework for obvious reasons, political and historical. And that explains why Syrian civilians have been the victims of the division and inertia in the international system. And it means that we're in a situation where I think if 5 years ago I'd said to you there are going to be at least 500,000 people dead, 5 million refugees, 1 million wounded, 7 million internally displaced, 85% of the lights out in the country, you'd have said, well, that's never going to happen. But if that is what's going to happen, we've got to do something. And I'm afraid that we've been playing catch-up all along. And now, of course, it's a Syria-Iraq crisis, not just a Syria crisis. The division of the country is deep. The people talk about the prospects for rebuilding. I mean, that is miles off because the bloodshed has been so widespread. And I'm afraid we're at the stage where staunching the wound is the absolutely essential first step. But the tools to do so are very, very weak, as you can see from the UN efforts in Geneva and elsewhere. And I'm afraid people are going to be writing PhDs and having political arguments about this for a long time to come, because the perils of intervention have been clear over the last 15 years, but the perils of non-intervention are also clear in the Syrian case.
Well, I want to thank you for your pointed questions. Thank the Aspen Institute, and especially thank David for his eloquent response.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you, Michael, for your moderation, and thank you all for coming.